Okay, boys and girls, let's talk about our next project. We're going to create a robot drawing and we're going to use form. Now, let's talk really quickly about forms before we talk about putting our robots together. We talked about forms in one of our other projects of the year, and we drew lots of different types of forms like cubes and cylinders, pyramids, cones, and we put these forms together to make a picture. We're going to take this a step further and not just draw the forms, but actually add something to them called shadows and highlights. So shadows and highlights is taking just the form and adding a dark area and a light area to show that the form has a shadow and a highlight. So I can imagine if the light was shining on this cube, the dark area would be the area of shadow of the cube, and the light area would be where the light is shining the most. So when you add dark and light areas to a form, and you don't just keep them blank, it makes them look a little bit more realistic, because everything in real life has these shadows and highlights. So we're going to use forms that have shadows and highlights to create our robot drawings. So your robot is going to have at least 5 forms or more put together, and all of them should have a shadow and a highlight on each form. We're also going to talk about putting some details into the background to tell where our robot is going to be. So to start, everybody needs this form worksheet, and you need a big sheet of gray paper, because this is where you're going to draw all your forms and then cut them out. So I'll have this looking at every time I draw a form today. Before I start drawing my forms though, I think I'm just going to do a little practice drawing in the corner of my gray paper, just thinking about what I want my robot to look like. So I can take a look at these forms and think about, what do I want the body of my robot to look like? What do I want the head to look like? What can be some arms and legs? And then just make a couple practice drawings. So for my robot, I really like the idea of putting a cylinder for the body, and then maybe a cube for the head. So I'm just going to kind of see how these would fit together to make a robot. And I kind of like how these long cylinders kind of look like tubes. I could maybe do those for some arms. And maybe I'll do some like cone or pyramid legs. So let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 forms so far. So I need at least 5. I'm pretty good here. So I can stop with this, or I can do another practice drawing. Maybe I want the body of the robot to be more like a rectangular prism. And maybe the head is more like a sphere. Maybe the arms could be like cones put together. So you're going to think about what you want your robot to look like. You don't have to just copy mine. Of course, I want you to make your own type of robot. So just put some forms together and see what you like. Now, once you have a robot drawing and you have a little sketch that you like, go with the one that you like the best. You can even circle it if you want. And then start to draw out your final forms. So you should draw these pretty big, because what we're going to do is cut them out and glue them to a really big background paper. It's going to be about this big. So draw your forms pretty big. So I know that I need a big cylinder to start. So I'm going to draw my big cylinder here. And then I can stop. Now it's time to add the shadows and highlights. For the dark and light areas of the cylinder and any of the forms, we're going to use chalk for that. So black and white chalk you will need. Ignore the gray area, because that's just the gray of your paper. You're just looking at the black and the white areas of the cylinder. So I know that the shadow is right over here. I can make just a little line on my cylinder, because I know it's just on the right side of the cylinder. And then once I have that area, I can just use my chalk to color it in a little bit. And then we know from our last project that blending with our finger will help the chalk be really smooth. So I can just carefully blend that out. And I don't need to worry if my chalk goes outside of my form, because we're going to cut these out anyway, so that's okay. So once I blended that a little bit, I can now take my white chalk and look at where the highlight is. So the highlight is where the light is hitting the very top of the cylinder and the left side. So I'll use my finger again to blend that out. And you might notice that you're going to get your fingers pretty dirty, so get a little rag from the sink so you can wipe your hands, because if I get the black chalk into my white, it's going to make some fingerprint areas, and I don't want that. So I'm going to have clean hands before I do the white part. Okay, so that's a pretty good form. Now notice when I cut this out, I won't see any of those smudges on the edge because I'm cutting it out nice and carefully. And this should look like a very real looking form now because I've added those shadows and highlights, okay? Almost like it's kind of popping out, like I could pick it up. So this could be the first step of my robot. I could glue this down for the body, and then I could draw my next form and then start piecing them together. So eventually we're gonna think about where do we want our robots to be, and we're gonna draw kind of a funny background for the robot onto the background paper, but we'll talk about the background later. Today I want you to worry about drawing out and sketching what do I want my robot to look like, and practicing drawing some of these forms and adding the shadows and highlights.